Hi, and welcome to my devlog. Today I want to share some progress on my game with you. I've made some additional enemies since last time that I want to show you, and I also developed more workflow for making environment assets that you might find interesting. So let's start with the new enemies. I wanted to make an enemy that can be used alone or in a supporting role for other enemies, or like a boss fight. So I came up with the idea of this disc-shaped drone that would be activated by some trigger, and then move to a location based on the player's current position and act as a stationary weapon. So for right now I have it hooked up to a key to show you. When I activate the drone, it will move to a place at a semi-random distance from the player at a certain height that I set in a file, and then stay there. And whenever the player gets within a certain distance, the drone will start to shoot some volleys of bullets downwards in a cone to disincentivize the player from carelessly moving around, so almost like an obstacle. And to create the semi-random distance, I implemented a simple random number generator, XOR shift. I use the XOR shift algorithm, and it takes the system time at the game startup as starting seed, and then randomizes numbers on that. Basically just works by bit shifting. It's quite easy. And then I made a few utility functions that will return a value within a certain range. So I made one for int and one for float. So in this I would pick a minimum distance from the player and a maximum distance, and then randomize a number in between that to use as the starting position for the enemy. And I really like it. I really like this enemy, but I do think it is a bit easy to avoid in isolation because it's very localized and you can just stand outside of the range. So I thought, what if I have a different version of the drone that shoots a laser at the ground and spawns an expanding laser ring from that point outwards? And I made that as well, and I can activate it here with a different key and show you. And so it will do exactly that. Trying to get that ring to expand properly and the collider of that ring to update properly as well was more difficult than I had expected. And after trying to do it using Godot's built-in collision primitives, I decided it would be easier to just bite the bullet and write my own code to do it, to generate that torus geometry and make it expand only in the XZ plane and not in the vertical layer as well. So I did just that, and it works great, I think. The ring looks very clean when it expands. I used the math function at first to make the expansion start slow and then get faster as it goes, to give it this little bit more energy punch in the beginning, that it's like building up and then expanding. For physics simulations in Godot, any object that the physics interacts with has two components, two meshes essentially. One of them is used for rendering, and this is the one you can see here, and it has a higher resolution. And there's a second one that is just used for collision, and usually that's lower resolution. My collision mesh for the ring only has 4 vertices along the ring's thickness, and then 32 rings around the perimeter along the curve. And the mesh that you can see has 16 vertices along instead, and then 64 around. And I think the lower resolution is not really noticeable to me for the collisions, and it saves a bunch on performance. Still, you could argue 32 rings is quite high, but if the ring expands quite large, then you can really tell the difference between using less there. And it might feel quite cheap if the collision doesn't match up with what you see. And to further improve performance, I only update the collider mesh every second frame. And in this project, I've set the physics to update 60 times a second. And this collider only updates 30 times a second, which I think is still plenty. When making the second type of drone, to differentiate them, I used a clever trick, at least I think so. Because instead of changing and modifying the original mesh that I used for the first type of drone, and then having to redo the UVs and the texturing, instead I just made a new small mesh, like an addition, that I can add to the bottom of the already finished asset, and just use a smaller texture and only texture that new part. And working this way, it would also be very easy to add more different types of drones if I come up with something good as well. Since I work alone, it's constantly in my mind to think how to save time on making all the assets. And with those made, I thought it would be cool if I had a type of docking station for the drones and other robot enemies as well, where they would go to charge or something while they're not flying around. So I modeled this small box that can serve as the docking station, and I also made this additional texture for that energy barrier in the front. I used Substance Designer for that. And when the drone gets activated, this barrier will be turned off and the drone can leave, and the lights will power up for the drone. And this barrier is also there to prevent the player from killing the inactive drones, because I think that kind of defeats the purpose. So here in the engine, I combined a few of those together in one element that then could be placed around the levels, and they can be activated due to some trigger of some events. And for now, I'm using my randomize function again to just pick one of the slots of that element and activate it for each time I press the button. So you can see it will pick on one of the available ones each time. And because those laser rings of that second drone can be quite punishing, I wanted to add some higher ground to the level. And those boxes that I made in the last video came in really handy for that. I think they really add to the world, and of course they were great for the gameplay as well. So this is really starting to look like some real place, I think. So take a look at that video if you're interested in how I made them. Personally, I always enjoy watching that type of making of video, so maybe take a look if you're interested. And I also made some more modular assets that I can build up the environments out of. And these concrete pieces, they were my test for some ideas I had for the way I develop them. It's for using an RGBA texture, so a texture that has red, green, blue, and alpha channels as a masked input, and combining multiple shaders, multiple materials together in a single shader. And I think it works really well. Essentially, I have one base material, and in this case, that will be the smooth concrete. And then I have 4 additional materials because I have 4 mask slots, so red, green, blue, and alpha. In this case, I have one with a damaged concrete, that's for those chipped edges, that's basically pushed in, and one with a dust-like material, that's for around the chipped edges. If you look at some real concrete, you would usually find some white, powdery, kind of chip, dust, this kind of thing. And another one that has some dark grime that I use around the edges of those materials where it might be touched a lot or bumped, something like this. And then the last one has a somewhat generic gray space dirt, just to break up the surfaces a bit and maybe ground them a bit to the ground or the wall, whatever they're attached to. To generate this mask texture, I am using smart masks that I made in Substance Painter with custom output channels and then a custom export setting where I combine those into one texture to then generate those masks. And in Painter, I'm using only tiling textures, and the pieces that I'm applying them to, they are UV'd in such a way that the edges will match up perfectly. The goal was that I can tile these pieces, for example, this 2-meter long piece that I'm using on the top or on the sides, and I can repeat those as many times as I want without having a noticeable seam in the textures and also not in the edge wear. So wherever they meet up, it should just continue. And if you look very carefully, you can see that certain surface details will repeat if you look very carefully, but you shouldn't be able to see where the pieces end. And on top of that mask, I'm also exporting a detail normal map for those masks, so that the chips, for example, they will show up in the final shading because the normal there should be pushing in. And in the standard Godot shader, you can use a detail normal as well, but they're just using a simple linear interpolation for the detail normal map to combine the regular normal map with the detail normal map. But that actually does not give the best results and is not correct. So I did a lot of research and I found this paper on this website where they're talking about different methods of combining normal maps. And the one that they suggest, which I ended up implementing, is called reoriented normal mapping. I think it looks very good and it's not that hard to get working in my custom shader code. So you can see the results here. And also they have this nice comparison of those different modes, so you can decide if it's worth the effort for you. And if you do implement this yourself, you will have to re-normalize the result before applying it back to the normals of your shader. Otherwise it will not work properly. If you need help with any of that, please ask me in the comments and I'll try to answer as best as I can. It's a bit technical and probably boring for most people. So that is what I wanted to share with you this time. And please let me know what you think, or if you have any suggestions for me. And with the status of development, with the tools that I'm making being usable, I can focus on making a bunch more assets and enemies and then further develop the level that I showed a few videos ago. So come back next time to see what I did, and thank you for watching.